This program is a video presentation via Zoom of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. Founded in 1951, the Roundtable hosts monthly presentations at a location near Washington, D.C., more recently at the Fort Myer Officers Club. For more information, go to www.CWRTDC.org.
Good evening, everyone. We have a very full and very interesting program ahead of us. It is my honor and privilege to introduce as our speaker tonight, Paul Severance. Paul is a 30-year veteran of service in the U.S. Army. He recently retired from the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., where he served 25 years as a professor of military strategy and subsequently as a professor of military science, educating senior military, civilian, international students in the areas of national, military, and homeland strategy, defense, military, and joint warfare, political and military geography, and maritime security strategy. Gosh, there's such a long list. I hope I got it all. He is currently a visiting professor of military history at the National War College in Washington, D.C. Dr. Severance holds a BS in Social Studies from Northeastern University in Boston, a master's degree in Systems Management and the Florida Institute of Technology, and a PhD in Adult Learning from Virginia Tech. He is also a faculty member of the Blue-Gray Educationist Society, where he conducts multi-day deep dive field studies of Civil War battlefields to include Gettysburg, Antietam, First Manassas, the Peninsula Campaign, and the 7 Days Battle. Dr. Severance is also an adjunct instructor at the Osher Institute at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, where he lives now, or close to, as well as he's a visiting lecturer at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia. He has previously presented at our roundtable as well as at the Williamsburg Roundtable, where he presented on the Lincoln Assassination Conspiracies. My favorite tour was my favorite presentation of his was at Fort McNair, when he walked us around the actual location where the scaffolds were built and bodies were buried. And also he took us up to the trial room too. Again, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Paul Severance. Welcome, Paul.
Good evening, everybody. It's a great honor to be here tonight. I need to give you a little background about this courtroom experience that I became involved in heavily in basically 2013, when they restored the courtroom at Fort McNair. And we started getting all kinds of requests, largely from legal groups, to come in and have a tour and have a presentation. And we found out that hardly anybody at the school had any real background in it. And ergo, I became the sort of the John Batchelder, if you will, of the courtroom, and immediately got threw myself into it. I couldn't believe what a fascinating subject this was. Since 2013, about 500 groups that we've had come through the courtroom, including Civil War Roundtable from DC at one time, way back, I think 2015, maybe. Unfortunately, it's currently closed right now by Fort Myer because of the COVID. But one of my prime purposes tonight is to try and get you interested in coming to see the courtroom. And when we can get that back up and running, as Kurt suggested, I would love to take you around the restored courtroom and the grounds of Fort McNair and reintroduce you to the Lincoln Assassination Conspiracy, the trials, the executions, the interments, and then by my count, about 115 branches and sequels that emanate forth in different directions from the courtroom. So my fundamental tension tonight as you see here, that I think is what makes this interesting to us today, quite frankly, is after the assassination of Lincoln and the manhunt and the decision to try the conspirators, on the left side, you see, of course, Booth and Davis. You see Judah Benjamin, Clement Clay, Jacob Thompson, members of the Confederate cabinet in Canada, and then below that, of course, the circle of shame there of the conspirators. And on the right side, you can see, of course, the commission, the military tribunal that was appointed by executive order on 1 May of 1865 to try the people on the left as unlawful belligerents. And there was a lot of concern in 1865, and there's a lot of concern today about the proper role for a military tribunal when it comes to trying citizens and the constitutional dimensions of that. So at that time, we don't really think about it, I think, but the commissioners that you see seated there, there's 9 commissioners and 3 prosecutors, are really faced with how to administer justice in the context of a nation that's seeking revenge. And the way I kind of like to think about it was, how did they just preserve the Constitution without destroying it through a military commission? Now, one of the things I usually like to do is find out how many lawyers are here, because you never want to tell a story until you find out, how many eyewitnesses are there. There's nothing hoses up a good story like an eyewitness. So hopefully we'll get some feedback from some of the folks here that are in the legal profession, as well as folks that are interested in the story of Lincoln and the story of the assassination and the subsequent trial. So this fundamental tension, which really began in 1865, is still with us today. And I'm going to try and step through that. We have a saying at the National Defense University: anything that's worth doing is worth doing superficially. And I'm going to demonstrate that tonight. As you can see, truth in lending here. I'm not writing a book, haven't written a book. I got nothing to sell. But my street cred, I would say, just goes back to being an enthusiastic amateur when it comes to the Lincoln assassination. I've got no one-man shows coming up. I don't have the answers, but the debate still goes on the jurisdiction of military commissions. I'd also like to address and dispel some of the myths and reconceptions that have attended the Lincoln assassination, the trial, executions and all. And like I said, get you excited to come visit. So here's the premise here. The members of the commission had to preserve the imperatives of the Constitution and not destroy it in the process of administering justice and holding the conspirators accountable for their crimes. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but what I will try to focus on, based on my research, are the characteristics, and some would even argue anomalies, of the military commission that was assembled and executed its mission at the Lincoln assassination. And so I look forward to your participation and contributions. And I want to thank the Roundtable for inviting me, and to Bill Binzel for his incredible segue, I think on the 13th. They're ready to get started. So let's do this. Not going to cover a lot of the basic scut work. Most of you are accomplished historians. You probably know this as well as I do. But to try and get us where we are for the trial, we call Plan A was to kidnap Lincoln and use him as a bargaining chip to free Confederate prisoners of war. Estimates of how many prisoners of war in 1864, early 65 range from about 140 to 175,000. in different prison camps around the North. And the South is just running out of manpower. They start the war, deficient in manpower, and it doesn't get any better. They attempt, the initial group that Booth puts together, attempts a kidnapping on March 17th, 1865, when Lincoln was supposed to attend a theater benefit at Campbell Army Hospital out in 7th Street. But he changed his mind and instead went to a ceremony to receive a flag from the governor of Indiana. And so the plan failed miserably. Eventually, we know it turns to assassination. And some of the forcing factors that seem to be the most relevant for driving the Plan B options start with the evacuation of Richmond on April 2nd. Recall Booth did a lot of his early acting and his OJT in the acting business in Richmond. To add insult to injury, it's occupied on the 3rd by Union forces and then visited by Lincoln and his son. Booth was allegedly irate that Lincoln would sit in Jefferson Davis's chair in the Confederate White House. Lee's surrender on April 9th was quite a traumatic event for Booth. And then to add more insult to injury, they had the grand illumination and the celebrations in Washington on the 13th, and the announcement that the original flag that flew over Fort Sumter would be raised by Major General Anderson, who was Major Anderson at the time of the surrender, down in South Carolina. We think the strongest evidence indicates that Booth's decision to proceed with assassination on Lincoln and Seward, Johnson, and Grant was somewhat spontaneous when he found out that Lincoln was going to attend the theater that night, and it was announced that Grant and their wives would also attend. And he is spurred into action to get his conspirators together and execute that evening. So he is going through just a massive emotional meltdown starting about the 2nd of April. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that Booth had planned to kidnap Lincoln, take him to Richmond, let the Richmond government negotiate. But now that the Richmond government, Jefferson Davis, has left the country, he's left the building, he's on his way to Georgia, there is no government that can negotiate with the United States government to release the prisoners. So that whole idea of kidnapping goes right out the window, basically on the 2nd of April. So the trial is slated. Secretary Stanton does an incredible job. Think about this. Assassination on the 14th, 12 days later, 26 April. Booth is dead. The 8 principal conspirators are captured and incarcerated, and Stanton has policed up just over 300, quote, material witnesses due to a massive manhunt. It was the largest manhunt in the country up to that time. Stanton brought in 300 detectives from Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, teamed them up with the provost marshals of Baltimore and Washington and north of the Potomac. And all those troops now that were flowing in to Washington in preparation for the grand reviews could go out and search and hunt for the rest of the conspirators. So by the 26th of April, Stanton's ready to go to town with this thing. And if you think about it, there were no videos. There was no drones. There was none of that electronic type of surveillance and policing. This was all just good, solid police work and well-organized search missions utilizing all the assets at hand. So I kind of compare it in my presentations to what happened in Boston with the Boston Marathon, how quickly they policed those guys up, but had high tech to help them do it. That was not the case in 1865. Stanton has three goals in mind. One is, I want the trial quick. Two, I want it secret. And three, I want all 8 conspirators hung. He didn't get any of that. He selects as the trial location here at, you can see on the left-hand side, at Greenleaf Point, also called Buzzards Point. Here's the penitentiary. In the center of the peninsula, here's the Washington Arsenal, the library area. And over here on the deputy warden's side, on the 3rd floor, is an empty room that's the laundry for the penitentiary. The penitentiary was closed in 1862 by Lincoln and turned over to the Washington Arsenal to use for logistics purposes. So it's empty. And as you can see, it's secure within inside a fort, secure within 3 sides of water. Stanton is running this operation with an iron hand, but events are going to overtake his personal desires for how the trial ought to be conducted. Most important, of course, is the fact that this trial will be secure. Stanton is absolutely convinced that what happened on the evening of April 14th is just the beginning of a massive wave of black flag warfare, guerrilla warfare, irregular warfare, call it what you may, and that disgruntled rebels and Southerners are going to descend upon Washington, and he is determined not to make that happen. If you go to Fort McNair today, there's a location up here in the yellow block. That's where the trial is. You can see down here the scaffold. If you look carefully, you can see that the drops or the gibbets are down, and the coffins, 4 of them, are piled up at the base of the scaffold. So this is obviously post-execution. And this is inside that courtyard, a wall 20 feet high, 18 inches thick, secure from anybody that would want to upset the trial and recover any of the assassination conspirators to make martyrs out of them. So this is the courtroom. Stanton didn't really care what the courtroom looked like. It was a laundry. They whitewashed it. They put gas lights in. The Arsenal workforce built all the furniture. They have a very exceptional workforce of carpenters at the Arsenal. What's interesting to me, all the times and all the pictures that I've seen of this military courtroom, I've never seen a US flag, which sounds a little bit surprising in a courtroom conducted by the military, but there is no record in any of the reports, newspaper reports, drawings, lithographs. This is what the courtroom looked like right after renovation. It's been filled out quite a bit more extensively. But again, Stanton didn't rest on glamour. He just wanted the trial to proceed. And he wanted all 8 conspirators up here on the dock. And here you can see a guard between each one of them. They cut a hole through the brick wall into the woman's cell block so that the prisoners could come into the courtroom without having to go through the courtyard. And they built a stairway so that the public and the newspapers and the attorneys could come into the courtroom from outside of the courtroom and also not have to go through the center of the courtyard in the Arsenal. So the military commission and the prosecutors are seated here. This trial starts in secret. General Grant and General Comstock, because of all the hue and cry in Washington from the newspapers, go to Stanton personally and say, hey, boss, you got to open this up. They think you're running a kangaroo court up here, and they think it's going to smack the Inquisition. Stanton finally agrees on 15 May, the trial is open to the public, but to get in, you had to have a pass signed by General Hunter and countersigned by General Hartranft. On some days in this courtroom, there were over 300 visitors, not including the folks there to run the actual trial, such as the commission and the prisoners and the guards. No air conditioning, just 2 windows that could be opened over here. Had to be tough sledding for folks to attend, and especially given 19th century clothing and the middle of the summer heat in Washington, D.C. So good on them. So these are the 10 principal conspirators. A little bit about them there. Obviously, Booth was shot down at Garrett's farm on 26 April. David Harold captured there. Asserat, Powell, Mary Surratt, and who am I missing here? Asserat and Harold, yeah, and are hanged. And then there are 3 life prison sentences for Dr. Mudd, for Michael O'Loughlin, and for Samuel Arnold, and poor Ned Spangler, who is the real loser in this outfit, winds up with a 6-month sentence. These sentences to be carried out at Fort Jefferson in the Dry Tortuga. So incarceration in 1865 was not a fun thing. In fact, the way the prisoners were initially treated, they were hooded. The hoods were kept on 24/7. They were manacled with what they call a lily cuff, which is a cuff used to manacle insane patients. But they couldn't move their arms around. They could only rotate and the arms, but not the hands. The cell block inside of the prison were 7 by 7 by 3.5 feet. So they were not the most comfortable accommodations, but you can certainly make an argument that the hoods and the manacles that you don't see here on the feet constituted cruel and unusual punishment and a violation of constitutional rights. But again, Stanton was so concerned about losing these guys and gal that he insisted on draconian incarceration measures. Initially, they were kept on board the USS Montauk and the USS Saugus in the river off of Washington Navy Yard, and eventually moved over the end of April and early May into the prison, where they were the sole occupants, because, as I said, the prison had been abandoned. In 1862, the detainees sent to Albany, New York, and the Army had responsibility for running it. For the prosecution, you had a pretty good group of guys. Brigadier General Joseph Holt, who was the Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Army and the Chief of the Bureau of Military Justice, was responsible for planning the prosecution campaign. He was a good friend of Lincoln. He had previously served in the Buchanan administration as a Postmaster General and the Secretary of War for Buchanan. Very distinguished jurist. John Bingham from Ohio. Early in the war, in the 1861-62, was a special judge advocate for General Holt. 1864, he won re-election back to Congress from Ohio, but he was convinced to join the prosecution team. And then Brevet, at this time he was a colonel, but eventually Major General, my throat's going here on me, Burnett, who his chops come from a series of treason and conspiracy trials out in the Northwest, Indiana, Illinois, that area. One source cited him as having conducted over 3,000 trials for treason and conspiracy. He was brought to Washington to serve as a special judge advocate as well for the Lincoln Assassination Conspirators trial. So it's a pretty good team. In fact, during the course of the trial, Holt did very little with the questioning. Bingham did 95% of the questioning of the witnesses. And he wrote the closing statement. If anybody's read that closing statement, it's a marvelous piece of work. And many authorities observed that the closing statement was really what sent Mary Surratt to the gallows. It was so compelling and so forceful that that's exactly how she got where she was, because the expectation was they would never hang a woman. And we know Mary Surratt was the first woman hung by the US government. And the expectation was that's not going to happen. And I'll show you something later on with the nooses that's kind of interesting. Now, on the other side of the table, remember that the first apprehension was on 15 April. That was Spangler. He was arrested and released. And then they had a spate of apprehensions on the 17th of April and continued on up. Basically, the last apprehension was David Harrell on the 26th of April. These, as I pointed out, individuals were not allowed access to legal counsel. They were incarcerated under hoods with the manacles, both hand and foot, except for Mary Surratt and Dr. Mudd were not hooded. Mary Surratt because she was a woman, and Dr. Mudd because he was considered a professional. But when the trial opens, basically on the 10th of May, they still do not have legal counsel. They have not met with lawyers whatsoever. So the first 2 or 3 days of the trial are spent procuring lawyers for the conspirators. And at the end of the day, they had a marvelous dream team. These people are good. I don't know if you can see it over here. John Ewing, Sherman's brother-in-law, very distinguished lawyer. Harold Stone, Frederick Stone from down at Port Tobacco. Robert E. Johnson was a attorney general under Zachary Taylor, a very well-respected constitutional lawyer. He, Edward Aiken, John Clampett represented Mary, and William Doster was also a provost marshal in Washington, D.C., and a respected lawyer. And he took care of Acerot and Powell, and then Walter Cox also took care of David Arnold. And there is some indication that they helped each other out, where one of the other lawyers like Cox would assist Doster back and forth. But they had very, very excellent lawyers under an extremely difficult challenge to try and prove their innocence and or save them from the gallows. But excellent legal support for the assassination conspirators. Now, the jury is 9 military officers. One of them is a lawyer, that's Lou Wallace. The others were more or less available and handpicked by Stanton. Burnett played a major role in that as well. Interestingly, 2 of the original members of the commission were Horace Porter and Cyrus Comstock. They were relieved after the first day of trial because they were on General Grant's staff and replaced by Colonel Tompkins and Brigadier General William Eakin. These are the jury for the trial. Seated with the jury, of course, are the 3 prosecutors that are going to execute the trial. Over here on the right, this is something we did in June 20th of 2015. We filmed it was called A Day in the Trial. We had 33 prosecution witnesses, no defense witnesses. The Confederation of Union Generals came down from Gettysburg and other places and started filming about 6 in the morning till around 9 o'clock that night. An amazing experience. You can see in the background the conspirators on the prisoner's dock. What's interesting, I'm going to jump into really what's the guts here of the presentation in a second, was how close the prosecutors and the commission were to each other both physically and probably in mind. The prison staff, Brevet Brigadier General John Hartranft was appointed Special Provost Marshal. He was also the commandant of the prison. This is his staff. This is Dr. George Porter. He and Hartranft would visit the prisoners every day, twice a day, and make sure that their health was adequate and that they were not suffering greatly from incarceration. And over here on the right-hand side is the executioner, Captain Christian Rath. I'll talk more about Captain Rath in a few minutes here. So here's the trial chronology. I'll let you look at that. Notice this emphasis on conducting in secret. That was dispensed with on 15 May. The first day of testimony is 12 May, after legal counsel has been accepted for the conspirators. There is some question whether the first official day was 8 May or 9 May. By the trial transcript, the first official day, formal session, was 10 May. Initially, Mary was seated at a table with her defense lawyers out in front of the prisoner's dock. And people began to chat about that. How come she's getting special privilege? And Bill Binzel, you can help me with this, I'm sure. The explanation I've been told is that under Victorian ethics, an unmarried woman, because she's a widow, could not be seated with a group of men that were not family. And eventually, on the 21st of May, she was put behind the dock, but in the corner of the room, attended by a single detective from Stanton's National Detective Police. Testimony ends on the 29th of June. They do about a day and a half of deliberations. Verdicts and recommended sentences. I finished up about 2:30 on the 30th of June. They do not go to President Johnson, who is the convening authority, until the 5th of July. Judge Holt personally delivers the trial documents and spends 3+ hours with the president, going over all of the documents in the packet. Johnson approves them on the 6th. They're returned to the prison, and General Hartranft, in the presence of General Hancock, who has been brought in from Winchester to oversee the security of the trial and to make sure the sentences are carried out, read the findings and the sentences, but only to the 4 condemned conspirators. The findings and sentences are not read to the other 4 defendants until July 17th. And so they have no clue what's going on the evening of July 6th. The scaffold, when the orders came back to General Hancock, it specified that the executions had to be conducted on 7 July between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. There's just one small problem. There's no scaffold. The prison, when it was originally built, was built under the reform movement. It was not designed for capital punishment. Captain Rath, who had at least one previous tour as a provost marshal, somehow gathered up a set of plans from a sheriff in Level Plains, Virginia, and built the gallows overnight using the workforce from the arsenal. Unfortunately, the prisoners are right next door in their cells and can hear the cutting and the sawing and the hammering and the dropping of the traps using ammunition to stimulate human weight. Had to be a long night, however you want to call it. To add insult to injury, for the 4 defendants who have no clue what's going on, after the executions, and they were allowed to have daily visits in the courtyard, they had to walk by that gallows every day. And I'm sure they were wondering every time they walked by, am I next? because they still hadn't been told their sentences. So, of course, we know 7 July, the execution and interments take place around 1 o'clock, 1:05, 1:06, somewhere around there. Some of the metrics, 51 days front to back. Prosecution had 10 days, plead their case. Defense had 18 days, provided defense. There were 366 witnesses. Prosecution had 199, defense 172. And this trial included African-American witnesses, which is rather unusual, but they were allowed to testify in the trial. There were 300 other material witnesses that Stanton and his military and provost marshal and detectives had policed up from all over Virginia and Maryland and DC and imprisoned in the old Capitol prison. In fact, Stanton policed up and arrested every single Confederate sympathizer in Southern Maryland that helped Booth and Harold make their escape. But he didn't know it at the time. And so they were never put on trial. There were 34 prosecution objections. They were all sustained. The defense had 15, 2 were sustained, and about 5,010 pages of testimony by the original count. There were also 11 members of the press who attended faithfully every day, and the word went out every night by telegraph to the Philadelphia Inquirer and by what they call press copies to the Washington Intelligencer, and then to the defense attorneys. So they had very good transcripts available on a daily basis, not only for the folks running the trial, but also for the nation who was following this trial with great interest. So these are some of the peculiarities that over the years, military commissions have come in and talked to us about it. JAG lawyers have talked to us. A lot of this is in the scholarly work done by folks like Steers and Mark Swanson and those types of guys. So this is what I think makes this trial really interesting. So let's kind of step through here real quick. They weren't charged with murder. They were charged with conspiracy. And then there were individual specifications. If you know anything about military justice, there's a charge, and then there's a specification about what happened. And the beauty of the conspiracy charge is it requires a lower level of evidentiary proof to convict for conspiracy. More importantly, though, it's based on the principle of vicarious liability. So what that basically says, if one person commits the crime and 7 others know about it, they're guilty by vicarious liability. So all you have to do to be guilty within a conspiracy, essentially, is know about it. And that's pretty much what caught up the 8 individuals at Fort McNair during this particular trial. The idea of vicarious liability has been reaffirmed in cases as recently as Charles Manson and Timothy McVeigh. But it is certainly a lot less difficult case to prove conspiracy than it is, say, to prove first-degree murder or even second-degree murder. So brilliant choice of charge, and then the specifications. Obviously, there was no presumption of innocence. There was denial of constitutional rights, the major one being there was no trial by a jury of their peers, which the Constitution guarantees. It was done by a military tribunal. The prisoners were incarcerated for almost a month with no legal counsel. The prisoners, except for Surratt and Mudd, were kept in hoods and in manacles, both hands and feet, whenever they weren't in the courtroom. As soon as they walked back through that door to go to their cells, the hoods went on, the manacles stayed the whole time. And that, of course, under the 8th Amendment, is cruel and unusual punishment. There was no opportunity for pre-discovery for the defense lawyers. A lot of times they were just surprised when witnesses showed up. There were a number of perjurers, especially at the front of the trial. The government had earmarked 68 witnesses to try and prove that Jefferson Davis and Judah Benjamin and the Confederate cabinet in Canada were really behind the conspiracy and the murder, and that Booth and his cohorts would just be a tool, but that this grand conspiracy was really engineered, bankrolled, planned, supported by Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government. And so they went to great lengths to try and bring in witnesses to prove that. Shortly, the defense, though, started to see through it. And it turned out that 3 of the major witnesses were perjurers who were testifying under false names. And once they walked out of the courtroom and the defense went to call them, couldn't find them. And so after about the 68th witness or so, Judge Holt said, okay, we're not gonna pursue that line any further. And they actually turned themselves to the trial of the 8 conspirators as opposed to a trial in absentia of the Confederate government. The prosecutor sat at the same table with the jury. That's rather unusual. And Judge Holt, who was the chief prosecutor, was also the trial judge. That's a little different. Counsel-client discussions had to take place in the courtroom where they could possibly be overheard by others and guards. They would not allow the counsel to meet with them in their cells. Very relaxed rules of evidence in this particular commission. Prosecution could produce any evidence that they determined to be relevant and probative. More importantly, hearsay testimony was allowed. So in this particular trial, hearsay was fine. Thank you very much. Motions, 5 minutes discussion. That's it. And this is interesting. Defendants cannot testify in their own defense. Now, that was usual in 1865. That is not unusual because they were presumed to be either lying or to be incompetent witnesses that might self-incriminate themselves. And so if all the testimony had to come from somebody external to the prisoners. One case that I just threw up here was a Marine captain on board the Montauk who heard Astaroth's confession while it was incarcerated there. They wanted to introduce that confession because it very heavily implicated Mary Surratt and Dr. Mudd. And the judge would not allow it. It was disallowed under the same principle as that would be the same thing as self-incrimination and a violation of the self-incrimination protections. So that was one case in particular where they did not allow that. Commission members, i.e. the jury, could question witnesses. Interesting, in 1865, you could either be a witness or a defendant. You couldn't be both. There was no opportunity to roll, become state's witness, and seek a lesser sentence. And this is basically what caught Weichman up as the principal witness that really did the most damage, along with John Lloyd, to Mary Surratt. There was no appellate authority except the president, because he signed the executive office appointing the commission. And the beauty of a military commission, unlike a civilian trial, where you have to have unanimous 12 votes to convict, or 12 votes for death sentencing, in a military commission, all you need is majority vote. That's 5 out of 9 for conviction, and all you need for a death sentence is 2/3 majority. That's 6 out of 9. So again, one of the advantages of a military commission in this particular case. But by the same token, military commissions are designed to work under time-compressed situations, such as the middle of a war. Unfortunately, what you lose there is the ability to have in-length discussions and investigation of evidence and witnesses, but you certainly get a quicker result in a shorter period of time. Another interesting thing I found interesting, after the testimony was concluded and they went into deliberation, both Holt and Bingham sat in on the jury deliberations with the commission. However, this was also normal protocol to ensure that the jury did not make mistakes with the letter of the law. So they were basically there as advisors to say, no, you can't do that. You can't do. They couldn't vote. They could not vote. But the idea was to make sure that the jury did not make any major mistakes in terms of interpreting the law and what they could do as far as verdicts and sentences. And actually, this particular dimension is seen as a link to the subsequent evolving role of both lawyers and law members in military courts going into the 20th century. So the bottom line, as Fred Bork down in Charlottesville likes to say, the process is important as the results in a criminal trial. So that's kind of the gist of what I find fascinating and interesting are these peculiarities, these dimensions, these anomalies. Most people, when you discuss this, are appalled. They say, well, it's just not fair. It's a drumhead court. I had one young man in one of my presentations, he was a docent at Ford's Theater, come over to me and say, Dr. Severance, where is the official symbol of the trial? And I'm thinking, the statue, blindfold, holding the scales. He said, no, the kangaroo. Where did they put the kangaroo? I said, okay, fine, gotcha. So the scaffold, fascinating piece of work here. This is the scaffold, pretty primitive, built overnight in the courtyard, just supported by these beams that get kicked out and the traps draw. You can see it's pretty solid, but it's externally braced. It's not dug into the ground. We actually tried to do ground penetrating radar to see if we could find where the shafts were, and there wasn't because they sat on the ground. This is a very special scaffold because you get to hang 4 people at one time. A lot like the scaffold in Blazing Saddles, where you hang the horse and the cowboy and get some efficiency of operation at the same time. But again, built overnight, and after the execution, souvenir hunters took to this thing with their pen knives, and gradually, over the weeks, it gradually disappeared as people took souvenirs at the time. Here is the location in the building today. This is Grant Hall off on one side, and inside the tennis court, you can see approximately where the scaffold is located inside the yellow circle here. So if you ever go over there, that's give you some kind of a landmark orientation as to the scaffold. You can see there's 4 soldiers who will knock the posts out on command of the executioner, Captain Rath. Interesting, when you talk about detailed history, they can actually identify this gentleman here, Private Cockshaw from Company K, 57th Volunteer, Pennsylvania, because he lost the finger. And he was with the Veteran Reserve Corps, and he actually got sick at the execution. The temperature on the day of the execution, I've seen as low as 92 degrees and as high as 104. Whatever it was hot at the time of the execution. That's why you see the umbrellas. The umbrellas are not for any mercy per se, but it's to make sure that the 4 condemned don't pass out from the heat because it's considered poor form to hang an unconscious person. And here you can see, again, Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Harold, and then George Asserat. And this is General Hartranft reading reading the actual death warrants at the time on the scaffold. The executioners were OJT, on the job training. None of them had really been a hangman before. They did not wet the ropes, so you got a bungee effect when the bodies fell and then sprang back up. If you look at Alexander Gardner's first photo, you'll see it's all blurred because that's what's happening. They put the rope on first and then the hood. Should have been the other way around. It wasn't a clean job. And then to add insult to injury, nobody's neck broke. So none of the four had their neck broken. And Lewis Powell, who's like 6 foot 1.5, about 170 pounds, is actually seen, even though his arms and his wrists are bound behind him and his ankles and his knees are bound with white linen, he's actually seen lifting himself up into a sit-up position at the end of the rope, trying to take that pressure off his neck. And by the newspaper accounts, because it's not in the official record, Powell lasts about 9 minutes before he finally succumbs, not to a broken neck, but to asphyxiation. So I could do a whole class on hanging. It's one of my specialties, but we'll save that for another time. Interestingly enough, under magnification, look at the number of loops in Mary's noose compared to the others. When they asked Captain Rath, how come you have less loops in Mary's noose? He said, I never thought we'd hang her. I never thought the US government would hang a woman. He said, I had to build the scaffold. I was up all night building the scaffold. Then I had to do the nooses. Hers was the last noose, and I didn't think we were going to use it. So I just put 5 loops in it. That's the backstory on Mary Surratt's noose. So this is the restored courtroom. If you go there today, you'll see it's got windows. This was renovated in 1969, 70, what they call the Cluse renovation. So it doesn't look today the same way it did in 1865. And basically, the rest of the prison was torn down in 1867 and razed, leaving just the warden's quarters as a historical artifact of the Lincoln assassination trial and executions. If you look carefully, you can see Kurt DeSoto and Bill Benzo right there. They attended the trial. So, no, just kidding, just kidding. So this is interesting. If you look at the photography, a young boy. History proves that he is a kind of a company mascot from the 16th New York Cavalry. His older brother was with the 16th Cav. He was given a pony and a cut-down uniform and somehow managed to make his way in to the execution and see the execution, of course, Mary Surratt and Lewis Powell, and wrote about it years later. In fact, his brother, along with Boston Corbett, were captured and sent to Andersonville prison. And the rest of the guys in the cavalry troop kept him there instead of sending him back home to New York. And so he got to witness the executions. One of these little quirks of history that's just, kind of interesting. 4 graves. The workmen from the arsenal would not dig the graves, so the soldiers had to dig them 2 by 2 by 6. They had to kind of bend Lewis Powell a little bit to get him in there, make it fit. Stanton wanted nobody to discover their graves, so they were buried inside the wall of the prison. They remained there until 1867, when the rest of the prison, including the wall, were torn down. They were reinterred in a warehouse at the Washington Arsenal. And in 1869, just before leaving office, President Andrew Johnson returned the bodies to the families and pardoned the 3 remaining prisoners at Fort Jefferson. And that would have been, of course, Mudd, Spangler, and Arnold. Michael O'Loughlin died in 1867 of yellow fever during a yellow fever outbreak at the fort. Okay, so Paul, what's positive here? Well, let's look for the silver lining. The trial, despite Stanton's best effort, was open to the public almost immediately. First testimonies on the 12th, the public's allowed in there on the 15th. It's had to get a pass, like I said, but at least the public and the news media were allowed in. Pretty good, top-notch legal defense team, literally a dream team like the O.J. Simpson team back in '95. All excellent, educated, experienced lawyers. Open access to the proceedings with immediately, almost immediately handing over of the daily transcripts to newspapers and the transcripts. This was interesting. Trial started every day at 10 o'clock. They would read the previous day's transcripts verbatim. After a while, the defense lawyer said, "We don't need to do this anymore. You know, we're wasting time." Judge Holt says, "No, we're going to do this and we're going to do it right." It goes back to the premise of I'm going to make sure I don't destroy the Constitution after we've just had a war with, at that time, 650,000 deaths. We're going to do this right. And so he insisted on having those verbatim readings every day. Pretty, I think, impressive number of witnesses, also including African Americans, be allowed to testify on both sides. Pretty extensive array of evidentiary exhibits. There were 98 total. I already talked about the 12 daily health and welfare checks by General Hartranft and Dr. Porter. Mary's health was a concern. She basically went on a food strike in the beginning, wasn't eating at all. Powell spent almost most of the trial constipated for a long period of time. When they found that Acerot was starting to lose his mind from the hoods, Dr. Porter went to General Hartranft, who went to Hancock, who went to Stanton, and the hoods came off on June 6th. And on the 20th of June, the prisoners were allowed to individually have daily walks in the courtyard. And at that time, reading materials were brought in, not newspapers, but reading materials. And the men were allowed tobacco. And they actually brought down some furniture for Mrs. Surratt from her boarding house so that she would be comfortable. Towards the end of the trial, Mrs. Surratt was having very serious health problems, vaginal bleeding. Hartranft and Hancock allowed her to move into the east anteroom of the courtroom, and the next day allowed Anna Surratt to stay with her almost till the end of the trial. Most recent, and John, you can talk about this, what I saw was that she was probably suffering stress-induced endometriosis because of her son, John Surratt, who we haven't even talked about yet. But at any rate, when Hancock ran for president in 1880, Garfield and the Republicans tried to pillory him, saying he was cruel to Mrs. Surratt, he was abusive, and everybody signed up, said that's not true. He did everything he could for that woman under the conditions. At the end of the day, Stanton didn't get his 8 hangings. The sentences were differentiated for the accused, pretty much based on what they did and their involvement in both the kidnapping and the assassination. And at the same time, the trial and sentences sent a direct message, deterrent message to die-hard Confederates: don't try this. Do not do this, because I will get you. And that was one of Stanton's intents at the end of the day. So we're not going to read this, but I wanted to point out 2 things. All kinds of questions. You can look through here. I mean, probably the one question I always get was Mary Surratt guilty? First question is a what? Conspiracy. Should she have been hanged? Probably not. Same thing with Mudd. Was he guilty? Yeah. But there's all, as you look back on here, there's all of these questions that spin off, like what was Miley Cyrus's role in the assassination of Lincoln? Just kidding. Just want to see if you're still reading. That's all. So there are a million rat holes that you can go down emanating from the assassination, the trial, the incarceration, pick one, if you're so inclined to do that. It's fascinating stuff. Love to tell you the story about Paul's missing skull. That's an interesting one. And then if you really want to go there, there's some branches and sequels that you can take off that the Lincoln assassination and all the attendant components of it opened up to broader scholastic inquiry. So all of these types of things, the history of U.S. military commissions that we're still debating today, impact of the Lieber Code, General Orders 100, Confederates in Canada. How did the Confederates still in the field influence Stanton's thinking? Even though Lee had surrendered, there was still somewhere about 140,000 troops in the field under arms in the Confederacy. So all of these areas really provide great opportunities to kind of do intellectual popcorn. That's what I call it, branches and sequels. If you're interested in it, I'm interested in it. So I chase these things down rat holes. Some more, Lincoln's dreams played a role, the evolution of presidential protection. That was a big factor in the assassination of Lincoln, the lack of it. What was the impact of the first presidential assassination on the nation writ large, both North and South? Henry and Clara Rathbone. Wow, what a story there. Booth's relationship with Lou Hale, and then my personal favorite, conspiracies. There are 7 major conspiracies associated with the Lincoln assassination, including Pope Pius IX, the Catholic Church, Andrew Johnson, and Edwin Stanton and the War Department. We're not going to go there tonight, but maybe sometime in the future, I can come back and talk to you about that. So that's a down and dirty. It's quick. Those of you who will not be able to sleep tonight looking at this dog, does it look like anybody you know?
Thank you very much, Paul. What an extensive presentation. Well, thank you very much. Very thorough, a wonderful presentation. We will get to some questions here in a moment, but I will, those lists of things that you had at the end, those were some of my questions too, and it is very interesting. One of the questions I had is whether the Dream Team, and I assume they did they write up memoirs or criticisms or biographies or any considerations about the trial that did lead to a lot of the changes that you're referencing in the Lieber Code or in the tribunal? Or did they kind of, as lawyers, perhaps just keep quiet?
Well, some of them actually wrote for the transcript. You will see a couple of closing arguments. I think Doster wrote a closing argument, and I think Cox wrote a closing argument, and it's part of the appendix, along with the Attorney General Speed's recommendation on the military commission. But yeah, there are other newspaper articles. There are other memoirs. I'll tell you one that's most interesting to me. I didn't put it in here, but it goes like this. On the 26th, let me read it to you. On the 26th of June, Lew Wallace wrote a letter to his wife. The trial is not yet over, but I say to myself, certainly it can't endure beyond this week, and do all I can to be patient. Judge Bingham on the side of the government speaks tomorrow, and the commission votes guilty or not guilty. I have passed a few words with my associate members and think we can agree in a couple of hours at the farthest. 3, if not 4 of the 8 will be acquitted. 3, if not 4 of the 8 will be acquitted. That would be if we voted today. What effect Bingham will have remains to be seen. Now, two parts to that. Bingham wrote a brilliant closing argument. I mean, it is long and heavy, and I mean, it's an incredible piece of work. And so one school of thought is that Bingham's closing argument changed everybody's mind about the sentencing or the verdicts and the sentencing. The second one is kind of interesting. This was proposed by a member of the Office of Secretary of Defense Military Commissions. He says, yeah, he said, you know, I wonder if there's undue command influence. So by the 26th, they finished pretty much all the testimony. And the next 2 or 3 days are closing arguments. And as you know, and most of the folks who are in the military know, when you got a major decision, even if it's legal, you brief it up the chain. You say, here's where we're leaning. Here's what we think we have. Here's where we're going with our deliberations. And this guy offered the thought that once Stanton heard that, he said, oh no, you go back and revote, you go back and relook at, no. And so undue command influence in a military commission, that's something we don't think about very often, but it could have been a real possibility, I would suggest, in this particular case. Plus the fact that the other place to look are in the papers. There's a lot of material in the different papers of the lawyers that are on file, you know, different universities, Library of Congress, things of that nature. That's where they found Atzerott's confession. I think it was 1997 in Doster's files, and it was never admitted as evidence. That's that one I was talking about with the Marine captain. And they found it in his files at his home. So yeah, so there was a lot written about this thing.
All right, I see Ted Hurt has his hand
Kurt,
up. Maybe he has a
Kurt,
question.
before you leave that, one other little note there is one of the members of the commission, General Thomas Harris, in 1897 published a book in which he was convinced that Pope Pius the Ninth or Sixth, I don't remember which Pope Pius it was, but he was convinced that the Catholic Church was behind Booth in the assassination conspiracy.
Yeah, and Harris is interesting because he's a doctor, but he is also a phrenologist. And so he's making observations based on the shape of people's heads, where their bumps are, things of that nature. That's a pretty objective way. Yeah, but that's right. He did. He was convinced that Pius IX and the Jesuits and the Catholic Church were behind the Lincoln Assassination. Of course, in the 19th century, it was not a good thing to be Catholic in the United States.
That's what I was thinking, Paul, is the anti-Catholic sentiment supporting a conspiracy.
Yeah.
Let me ask, was there an explanation of why they waited so long after until the July 17th? Were they waiting to perhaps change the verdict, or, you know, obtain some additional information? Why put those guys through misery? The
only thing that I saw, and I don't know, Bill, you might be able to jump this one. I've never seen anything along the lines of inquiry that you're suggesting. What I do know is that they were originally going to send them to Albany, to the federal penitentiary in Albany. And Stanton said, oh, I don't think so. And that may have been part of the issue of, you know, why they were delayed, that they had to prepare passage and all that. I also think that, this is way out. Once they hung Mary Surratt, everybody lost their taste for this. And I think everybody, Hancock, Lew Wallace, they just wanted to get out of town and move on. Hartranft, you get this sense of, I want to be done. I want to go home. The war is over. And, that may have just fallen through the cracks. That nobody took the time to go in there and read the sentences. Beyond that, I'm out of Schlitz.
Why would you? I mean, why would you inform the other conspirators of what their fate was to be? I think, Paul, you're absolutely right. Part of it was, were they going to go to Albany? Were they going to go to Fort Jefferson? The kind of the unseen hand behind all of this, as Paul alluded to, and I think he's absolutely correct, was the hand of Edwin Stanton. And one of the things that is widely unknown is the person who drafted the original charges against the conspirators was not Joseph Holt, the ultimate prosecutor. It was, in fact, Edwin Stanton. And Edwin Stanton's personal secretary attended the trial almost every day. Stanton never was there, but his secretary, Major Watson, was there almost every day.
Thank you, Bill, for that addition. Now, we have a lot of folks in the chat very interested in the conspiracies. And two questions there is, one is, what is your favorite conspiracy? But number two is whether there was any follow-up on any of these conspiracies by the federal government or by military tribunal.
Well, let's see. Favorite conspiracy. I think for me, it probably has to be the Catholic, the Catholic Church and the Pope, because it's so, it's so far-fetched. The thing that's interesting is that all of the conspiracy theories are built on a tiny grain of truth, a tiny factoid, a tiny something that happened, and then, it takes on a life like a piece of coral. It just accrues, grows. And I'm trying to think, most of the conspiracy theories, I'm going to say, in fact, almost all the conspiracy theories are explored by private folks that wanted to write a book. The Dave DeWitt, the judicial murder of Mary Surratt. Hanchett's book on the 7 major conspiracy theories is excellent, and I don't know of any formal military government investigation or inquiry into any of the conspiracy theories. These were all kind of privately generated. Is that right, Bill?
Well, actually, there was a congressional committee in 1867 that was the Committee on the Assassination of Lincoln, that was headed by a guy by the name of George Botwell, who issued a report that's somewhat ambiguous as to whether or not there was Confederate involvement. But yes, there was a committee that tried to explore that in 1867 and really didn't get very far. And the minority report kind of blew up what the majority report had said. But it's interesting reading. And it's been reprinted and available on Amazon and whatnot. But that's the only formal investigation by the federal government that I know that came about after the trial.
Right.
Yeah, and there was also I have seen some thinking. I'm going to use the word thinking. That says that once that Johnson issued the general amnesty, everybody kind of lost interest in chasing anything down. That's when 2 years later, Robert E. Lee Jefferson Davis is freed from Fortress Monroe. Certainly, Stanton is not going to investigate himself. Stanton and the War Department and his complicity and setting Lincoln up to be assassinated that night at the theater, et cetera, no protection. He wouldn't let Grant go along with him. He wouldn't let Major Eckert go. But other than what Bill, which I had not seen before, offered, I've not seen anything beyond that. I mean, most of the, a good slew of the guys from the Confederate cabinet and the Confederate government went overland. I mean, went offshore. They, went to Canada, they went to England, they went to Brazil, and there was no interest in probably chasing them down. What I think the other factor here is that Reconstruction started to spin out of control almost immediately. When the radical Republicans were freed up from Lincoln's moderate hand, as he had announced at the second inaugural and as he announced on his April 11th speech, and the terms he allowed Grant and Sherman to offer to the Confederates. And once that started, I think there was just a concerted effort to put the heel, of the boot on the South in as many ways as they could.
I see Greg Howell as a question, but I want to follow up on conspiracy theories. I see Melanie has talked about running into folks about conspiracy theories, and there are conspiracy theories in every area of history, even now. And I find it very interesting to find out the thinking about conspiracies. What is it that makes people believe in conspiracies and continue to believe in conspiracies? And if anybody has an opportunity to look up analysis of conspiracy theories, it's very interesting. For example, you could give somebody a fact that disproves what they think, and instead of saying, "Oh yeah, I'm wrong," they move the goalposts where they say, "Oh, well, if that's the case, then maybe there's some other issue." I think Melody made a reference to that, where she gives tours at the Smithsonian American History Museum, and a lady explained to her that Booth escaped and moved to Texas, where he raised a family. She would not be convinced otherwise. So that is very interesting.
Yeah, you're talking about Finis Bates and the Mummy.
Mm-hmm. No, and there's a very interesting thing that someone asked about or mentioned. Craig Howell talked about how the confession only surfaced in 1978.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, it disappeared, and it was actually, if you read the transcripts, it was discussed that there was a 7-page written confession from Atzerodt to McPhail and I forget the other guy's name from Baltimore, who came down and took the confession. And it somehow, nobody knows how, it just kind of like escaped notice.
Would that have changed the result?
Oh, well, if you read it, again, it's in Steer's book, on the trial. It clearly implicates Mudd in terms of resourcing and provisioning and Mary's. I mean, if my personal opinion, I'm not a lawyer, if that had been introduced, Mudd would have hung.
Well, and John Willen said Mudd escaped execution by 1 vote.
Yeah, 1 vote. But
Atzerodt's confession is also very, very damning to Mary Surratt.
Right.
Atzerodt says that Booth sent Mrs. Surratt down to Surrattsville on the afternoon of the 14th in order to find out where the pickets were and what time the pickets would be called in. That was never admitted as part of the trial, but again, very damning toward Mrs. Surratt.
The,
Craig, or Ted Hurt, do you have your hand up? Are you interested in asking a question? Ted is, by the way, he's a professor at George Washington University.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so my question goes to the defense team. I mean, Robert E. Johnson was a public figure. He'd been a senator from Maryland. Do you think that those attorneys did the best they could with what they had by way of facts to work with? Or looking back the way you were talking about the rules, were the rules of military commissions, not just this one, sort of tilted so in a civil trial, as we talk about with Surratt later, that a defense is at a disadvantage even if they have the best trial advocates in the country?
well, let me take a stab at that and also take a look at Bill Shepard's note about ex parte Milligan. Again, not a lawyer, I'm a dumb helicopter pilot, you know. The argument with the military commission initially was, number one, these guys, gals, were unlawful belligerents under the Lieber Code or General Orders 101. And they were trying to decapitate the leadership of the United States government and basically gain a respite for the Confederacy so that they could get out of town and reform and do whatever they had. The second argument was that Washington was under martial law. The third argument was that the crime incurred on a military base, and to that end, they even had Grant testify early in the trial as to what the extent of his military control or his military command was, and whether it included Washington. So at that point in time, it was viewed as a decapitation effort by unlawful belligerents. That's the key word, unlawful belligerents. And that's what Speed puts into his opinion. And in fact, Speed writes, this trial should or words to this effect, should not ought to be conducted by military commission. It must be conducted by military commission. The other factors, and again, here's a heavy hand of Stanton, is the fact that Washington, okay, by history, by culture, by social, political, pick one, is a southern city. Stanton was absolutely convinced there was no way in hell he was going to get 12 white men, because blacks couldn't be on juries, 12 white men to convict, 12 votes for conviction of these Southerners. And for that reason, he was deeply concerned about jury nullification and saw the military commission as a way around it. Now, keep in mind, this is kind of interesting. Remember that all 9 jurors, I didn't mention this in the presentation, all their commissions were signed by Lincoln. They're military commissions, either as regular Army officers, there were 4 regular Army officers, or as U.S. volunteers, were signed by Lincoln. So you got to wonder about that kind of informal prejudice there. But the original argument, yeah, the courts were open, but this is a military crime. This is not a crime to be tried in a civilian court. And that's why, Bill, comment about ex parte Milligan or ex parte Milliken, depending where you come from, is true. It says that, military trials can't be held where, the courts are running. But and Bill, you can probably help me better than this, or Kurt, 2003, 2004, there were 3 Supreme Court decisions having to do what Bush and Hamdi and can't remember it. I got it here. Basically, the Supreme Court said, yeah, the president can convene a military commission for these types of actions as long as constitutional rights are maintained. And so that's why we still have military commissions. And
Paul, I'm sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, no, I agree with you. And Ex parte Milligan was a Supreme Court decision in 1867, or 1866 rather, a year after the conspirators trial. The only court that has applied the facts of the conspirators trial in the aftermath of Milligan was a case brought on behalf of Dr. Samuel Mudd, Ex parte Mudd, which was heard in the Southern District of Florida in 1868. The judge in that case, Judge Thomas Jefferson Boynton, specifically ruled that Milligan was not applicable to the Lincoln Assassination Conspirators because they were not attacking Lincoln as an individual. They were attacking Lincoln as the commander-in-chief of the Army, and their motive was to disrupt Union military operations. One can argue whether or not Judge Boynton's decision was correct or not, but it has never been overturned. In fact, as Paul just alluded to, it has been used as precedent in some of the more recent trials dealing with the detainees at Guantanamo Bay. So yes, you can cite Milligan and you can question whether or not Boynton got it right, but the fact as a matter of law is that decision to use military tribunal has been upheld by the federal courts and has never been overturned.
You know, as a matter of fact, I support Paul's comment about Stanton's concern about not being able to get a conviction in a civil court. We have the example of John Surratt, who was tried in a civil court, and you call it a hung jury, but he was not hanged. But he was not convicted for exactly the reasons that you mentioned, Paul, and that Stanton was probably concerned about.
Well, there was another factor that I'm aware of in terms of the conspirators in the Lincoln case, and this is in James Speed's opinion, is the fact that they were not working for private gain. Had they been working for private gain, that may have pushed it down to a civilian court, because the courts were in fact operating as a civic matter or a criminal matter. But because they were working for the government, that's the argument, that's the grand conspiracy theory, they were unlawful belligerents that were not entitled to, basic rights under civil law.
And wasn't there some money suggested from Jefferson Davis to support efforts like this? So if they were paid or doing it for money, it certainly was not from private, but from government.
Yeah, well, yeah, Booth went up to Canada in October and drew a bunch of money out of the Bank of Ontario up there after meeting with Clement Clay and other members of the Confederate cabinet. And I guess the argument is he used that to bankroll, like for instance, he basically bankrolled or paid for all the expenses for Lewis Powell. It wasn't for his personal gain. It was for a governmental or not philosophical, but principled type of activity by which he did that. Mm-hmm. And so the old saying, follow the money, is great, but it was real hard to do in 1864, 65 with Booth and the conspirators. Somebody wrote, hey, I'd like to hear about the Confederate cabinet in Canada. Hey, I can give you 8 hours on that because these guys were bad actors. Let me tell you what. And some of the things that they did is just pure out and out terrorism, flat out. Tried to burn down New York City, example. St. Albans raid, example. USS Michigan, So,
well,
love to do that some point in the future.
It sounds like people are calling for a follow-up. Norville, you seem to want to have a question there, so go ahead.
I was thinking about John Surratt, and I agree with what's been said there, but I wonder if Paul ever ran into George Sanders in Canada and what his position was with the people up there in Canada, the Confederates.
Say that again.
Question of what, have you ever run into George Sanders?
Did
up in Canada?
you mean Booth?
Yes.
No, I think that Booth's only real confirmed rendezvous was with Clement Clay.
Well, I knew it was with Clay, but Sanders was up there also. Very
Well, and so was Martin, Patrick
Yes.
Martin.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did collaborate, if you will, but I don't think he. I may be wrong, but I don't think he ever. By the time Booth went up there, I think Jacob Thompson had already recalled, and General Lee, not Robert E. Lee, but the other General Lee, had been sent up there as a replacement commissioner.
Tim Shantz has asked whether the original plan to kidnap Lincoln in exchange for POWs was that ever sanctioned by the Davis administration? And Tim, if you want to open up your mic and follow, if you have any follow-up questions, go ahead.
My understanding of it is that Booth, number one, he promised his mother, "I'll never join the army. I won't go in the military." Booth was his mother's favorite. Based on his experience in the South and his ability to move between the lines as an actor, he thought that his contribution could be this release of massive numbers of Confederate prisoners in northern prisoner of war camps. By all indications, initially he did that on his own money, with his own investment stocks and things of that nature. And when they tried to go to trial, and Holt and Burnett and Bingham tried to prove the Confederate direct involvement, they couldn't. There were all kinds of, one example, they had Henry Kidd Douglas sitting at the trial, supposedly to testify that Booth had met with Confederates in Mosby's Confederacy in Winchester, and they could never prove it. And so I think that my conclusion is that most of the idea, number one, was Booth's. Number two, I think most of the initial setup came out of Canada. And number three, if there's a connection, maybe it's between John Surratt and the Confederate government, because remember, Surratt was running the trap lines from Richmond up to New York and into Canada. And without Surratt, Booth doesn't have Powell, Herold, or Atzerodt. He's only got Arnold and O'Loughlin. And so through Dr. McQueen, through Dr. Mudd, through the letters of introduction, I think from Patrick Martin, that's how he gets to Surratt. And Surratt then, in December of 1864, is introduced to Mudd, and that's when the rest of the team comes together. But I don't think there was any direct, based on what I've read, Jefferson Davis or even Judah Benjamin Seddon, direct involvement in it. They may have said, "Yeah, it sounds like a good idea. Let me know how it comes out." The other thing that's interesting, and it's one of these, if you really want to go there, is what impact did the Dahlgren raid, the Kilpatrick Dahlgren raid, have on the thinking of the Confederate government? When, Dahlgren is killed and they find a letter basically ordering him to go in and murder the, Confederate president and the cabinet. Now, that is occasionally cited as a reason for Davis's acquiescence, in the Booth escapade. But the direct linkages, direct connections are not there. Plus the fact, this is me now, Davis is a West Pointer, Lee's a West Pointer. irregular warfare is not viewed as honorable warfare by West Point graduates. Out in the West, Quantrill's Raiders and, Jesse James and Champ Ferguson and all that, different story. But in the East, I don't think the idea of assassination and things of that nature gained a lot of headway with guys like Davis and Lee and Longstreet, West Pointers, especially at the end of the war. Remember what Lee said to his troops when he came back after surrendering to Grant? They said, "Let's go to the mountains. We can fight them." And he said, "No, go home. And if you make as good citizens as you were soldiers, it'll be good." And he wasn't buying it. He wasn't going to have any part of it. So it's kind of a squishy. If you want to go there.
Okay, thank you. Norvell, do you have a follow-up question? We'll let you have a last question.
Just one question, if Paul's ever written anything or published anything.
Everything I have written and published have been student texts, mostly on national security strategy and responsibilities for national defense. And those were basically inside the National Defense University. I don't like to write. I like to teach. I mean, I like to tell stories, if you haven't figured that out.
Well, I have some good news for you, Paul. By our recording this presentation today, and once we get your approval to post it, you will have published something. Thank you very, very much for a wonderful presentation.